Merhabalar arkadaşlarım. Do I take notes when I read books? Should you take notes when you read books? And if you do take notes, exactly how do you take those notes? That's what this video is going to be about. So, should you take notes? This question we should get right out of the way. It depends on the book that you're going to read. There are some books that you might not want to take any notes because you just want to enjoy the book. I don't think every book you should be looking at it as like I'm going to get every fact possible from this book and no one will know more facts about this book than me. But at the same time, maybe not every book you should read with a really relaxed attitude because somebody might ask you, oh, where did you read that from, this book? Oh, what page? I don't know. I didn't take a note. And so sometimes you want to take notes. Now, books where I won't take any notes, however, are probably books like The 12 Caesars. When I read this book, I didn't take any notes. It was something that was already, the facts in the book are contested, but also it's a casual read for me. Another book I might not take any notes with is a recent book, a newer book. It's Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography. I most likely won't take any notes when I'm reading that. And so you can read some books without taking notes. Don't get me wrong, it's fun just to read, and so you can read books without taking notes. However, I think in maybe 6 out of 10 cases or 7 out of 10 cases, you're going to want to take notes. So now let's talk about how you should actually take notes. So I have a system for how I take notes. I have a set of sticky notes that I use, and I color coordinate the sticky notes with customized categories. And I want to show you these categories before I give you an example of how I do it. For starters, something I'll do is I will highlight interesting facts. Now when I say interesting facts, these are facts that are going to be really interesting independent of the arguments they support inside of a book. With Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, he was talking about whether nuclear deterrent was an explanation for the long peace that we've experienced since World War I, World War II. And he points to the idea, or not to the idea, but to the fact that countries have, such as Iran, have either dropped or adopted a nuclear policy in a rather whimsical way. They've adopted a nuclear program in this year, dropped it in this year, and a lot of countries have actually done this. And so because there's a consistent dropping in adopting of a nuclear program, Pinker uses this as evidence that the nuclear deterrence theory doesn't work. Now that's just an interesting fact on its own, however. The whimsical nature of countries adopting and dropping nuclear programs I thought was interesting on its own, and I think that could be a fact used outside of the arguments that Pinker was using them for. Another thing I will do that I learned primarily from reading philosophy books, if you've ever taken a philosophy course, this method will definitely be familiar to you because you can't read philosophy books without doing this method, and that's highlighting the premises to a main argument. I'm going to go back to Steven Pinker here because it's the most fresh book on my mind. In Better Angels of Our Nature, Steven Pinker tries to explain the long peace, and I talked about previously the nuclear deterrence thing, but he also has reasons why he thinks there is a long peace. Not just because the nuclear deterrence thing was an explanation that it wasn't nuclear deterrence that gave us long peace. He also proceeds to say that, well, there's an increase in the rise of democracies and a decrease in the number of autocracies. He says an increase in the rise of democracies, anocracies, which are failed democracies, and decrease in autocracies. That's one premise to his argument. Another premise was that the long peace is also liberal. The number of countries that have engaged in international trade has risen. The number of countries that have intergovernmental organizations, so like oil companies, oil company boards or whatever, natural energy boards that work with one another between borders, that has also increased. And countries that have economic ties to one another are less likely to engage in a violent conflict when there's an issue that has to be resolved. So in the book, I highlighted these sub-arguments, and that was basically his way of concluding that the long peace wasn't a nuclear peace, it wasn't a peace won by military deterrence, but it was in fact a peace that was won by liberalism, trade, and economic connection, and the rise of democracy. Now, another category I will use when I'm taking notes is areas where I really disagree. Going back to Better Angels of Our Nature, Steven Pinker has a section on the psychology of killing. It's very brief, and he talks about a study that was cited in this book called The Psychology of Killing. The study is famous to begin with, but his comments on the study were that it's just dubious. He didn't explain why. There was a very brief paragraph saying it was just a dubious study. Not only did he call the study dubious, but he was also saying that the natural inclination that people have towards one another to not kill doesn't exist. But on top of that, he also said that it wasn't a factor that explained the decline in violence. I agree with him that it might not explain the decline in violence, but I don't agree with his take on the psychology of killing and the nature of our natural instinct to not kill one another. Why? Because I read a book called The Psychology of Killing, where he goes over a whole bunch of research about how soldiers would load muskets 23 times, and so you have evidence of muskets not being fired. And there's just not a few muskets, there's like 20,000 plus muskets that have double loading. There was a lot of soldiers who, after wars, reported that they didn't actually fire at other enemy soldiers intentionally, and they tried to miss. You also have stress injuries, basically like PTSD, and people who were at a greater distance and more detached from the humanity of the situation when they killed people experienced lower rates of stress injuries. Bombers who bombed cities had lower rates of stress injuries, despite the fact that they killed more people, than soldiers who might have shot one person up close. So I would disagree with Steven Pinker here, because I read other books that would lead me to think that, well, there is an innate instinct to not kill one another, but it might not be a significant enough factor to explain systematic declines in violence, which, in that point, I agree with Pinker. Now, something else I will do is I will search for external information to verify claims. I was reading a book, I still am reading the book, this book called The Ripple Effect, which is about water quality, water politics, and so on and so forth, and how that's going to play out in the 21st century. And he made a claim that we can't recycle water infinitely, because each time we do so, it gets worn out. Now, this paragraph actually tried to it insinuated that there was a high level of scarcity with water, but when you read externally, you get a different image than what the author was giving me. It turns out that it's not that the claim is true. Okay, what he is saying is true to an extent. We could theoretically recycle everything, but the problem is our technology isn't at the point where we can actually get everything out of water, and so sometimes things just can't be removed from the water. On top of that, we could also get salt water. The problem being, though, is that it's expensive to get salt water, and not every country could afford to engage in desalination programs. Therefore, there is a sense of scarcity, but it's more to do with economic limits than it is to do with absolute levels of water available to us. And so the author can kind of give you a little bit of a misleading image here. And in that case, I'm glad I looked for external sources, because I could have been a bit more of a doomsday theorist if I only read what the author had to say. So those are the categories I tend to use when I'm reading. I don't like to take quotes out of books, because quotes I find are very meaningless when they're not in the proper context that they should be in. Because what makes a quote really good for me is when it summarizes this very in-depth, elaborate idea right at the end of a paragraph, and it's placed right at the end of the paragraph. That makes the quote like mwah, right? But if it's just a quote on its own, I don't care for it. So to summarize the main points regardless, when I take notes, the categories that I'm currently using are interesting facts. That's number one. Interesting facts I will use. I will highlight the premises to arguments. I will highlight areas where I disagree, and I will highlight areas where I need extra information because I'm a bit suspicious about the nature of the claim or how to interpret the claim. I also want to say that the tools I use when I'm writing, I do not use highlighters. If you highlight books, you are abusive. Get help. Use a pencil. The pencil's fine. You can also use sticky notes. I've heard some people complain about sticky notes because it damages the page over time. It's not that big of a deal. It's better than highlighting or bending corners, right? Sticky notes and pencils are really all you need. Maybe a notebook if you want to write something down. And you can also get index cards. I've done this before where I've grabbed an index card or just like a little card that you might turn into a flashcard, and you can just write section by section the areas that you've highlighted and what they mean, so that way you don't have to flip through the book and say, this sticky was that, this sticky is this. You can just refer to the index card. But with that being said, guys, this is how I take notes. Let me know if you have any custom categories of your own for note taking, because I want to be able to take better notes. Obviously, I'm going to mature as I read and make different categories. I've done this with my writing. This is just the nature of being a reader. Let me know what you think of some of these categories, if you have better ones. And with that being said, tschüss.